All right. Hello. Welcome to Unit 2 of U.S. Government, AP Government and Politics. This is going to be homework 1A, so this is going to cover topics 2.1 through 2.3. Before we do that, let's go ahead and quickly overview what Unit 2 is going to look like. So Unit 2 is all about the interactions among branches of government, okay? This is going to be basically separation of powers. We're going to be looking at Federalist 51, like the system that was put in place in response, right? Legislative, executive, judicial. This is going to take the form of separation of powers, so the idea that the branches have different jobs. Checks and balances, the idea that the branches can check each other's powers and limit each other's powers in order to not allow any one branch to get too powerful. And then the ideas of the roles and powers, behavior, and checks of each branch. So we're going to look at, for example, the legislative branch. Who is in the legislative branch? Like what people or groups or offices? What can they do? How do they do that thing? And then how are they limited by the other two branches? And how they limit the other two branches as well. For key documents, we're going to be looking at the Constitution, which is Articles 1, 2, and 3 mostly, because Article 1 sets up the legislative branch, 2 sets up executive, 3 sets up judicial. And then we're also going to be looking at Federalist 78. And I think actually, now that I say that, we're going to have another Federalist paper in there as well, but we're not there yet. We'll also be looking at just one big Supreme Court case for this unit, which is Marbury versus Madison, which is 1803. You've already studied this in APUSH probably, or U.S. history. And then we'll also be going over the ideas of the bureaucracy, like the agencies and offices that are in the government and their authority and what they can do. So let's start with 2.1. 2.1 is the Congress, the people and offices and organizations within Congress. And so the biggest things you need to know is that Congress is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives. You need to know the difference between those two branches. Okay? So to start out, the basis of Congress is republicanism. We elect Congress people as representatives, right? And so those representatives take the form of republicanism in the United States. Now, to do this, we have a bicameral legislature. Just as a review, last unit you learned that this was a result of the Great Compromise or Connecticut Compromise. Bicameral, bi means two, cameral means rooms. And so it means there's two rooms in the legislature, or two houses, okay? And that takes the form of the House and the Senate. So now let's talk about the differences between the House and the Senate. Okay, number one, the House and the Senate are different in their membership size. The House is much bigger. It has 435 members, and that is because it is proportional representation. You need to know that. Proportional representation is the House. That means that bigger states get more representatives in Congress, in the House of Representatives, and the Senate, and then smaller states get less, bigger states get more, smaller states get less. And then in the Senate, there's equal representation. There are 100 members in the Senate. It's because each state gets 2 senators times 50 states is 100 senators. And we'll talk more about why that creates some complications, because it's an even number, so there are ties, and how we fix those ties later on in the unit. So you do need to know that the House and Senate are different in membership size, and you do actually need to know the numbers, the 435 and the 100, just to understand the difference between proportional and equal representation. You also need to understand the differences in formality of debate. The House is actually a very formal place to be. It is a very formal institution. There's a lot of rules around how they debate. They're not allowed to interrupt each other. They're not allowed to talk over each other. They have to actually get on a schedule to debate, and they're able to be silenced by the House Majority Leader or other leadership in the House very easily. And this is for a reason. It is because it is a huge group of people, right? Imagine being in a class of 435 people. That would be wild, right? Some college classes are that big. And you can't just talk whenever you want in a room of 435 people. It's chaos if you do that. So you have to have really strict rules. The Senate, on the other hand, is actually very informal, and it's because there's only 100 people in there, right? And 100 people seems like a lot, but really your senior class is about 80, so it's not that much bigger than all the seniors at New Tech, right? And so it would just be like if you got the senior class together for a senior class meeting, like we did last month, right? Not that crazy of a room, and it's not that wild for someone to raise their hand and ask a question. So it's a lot more chill in the Senate. The other thing, though, to kind of keep in mind there is that there are some procedures in the Senate that are different from the House. And we will talk more about that later on in 2.2 in just a minute. Okay. The other next thing to know is the difference in term limits and elections. So, excuse me, the House and Senate do not have term limits, as in how many terms they can serve, but they do have shorter terms in the House and longer terms in the Senate. And there's a reason. The House has 2-year terms and the Senate has 6-year terms. So it's kind of easy to remember. All the term limits in America are even numbers. So the House is 2, President is 4, and the Senate is 6. The reason for the Senate having longer terms is that the Senate is supposed to be slower evolving, right? Like it's a smaller body, and so it's supposed to be the upper house. And so you want people to have a longer term there to gain some expertise and to become an expert in like their committees and things like that we'll talk about in just a minute. Whereas the House is supposed to be closer to the people. They're supposed to be more responsive. They're in charge of the budget. And so they're shorter terms so that if there is any corruption in the House, it can get voted out very quickly, only 2-year terms. And so that means that a third of the House gets reelected every 2 years. And so every 6 years, the House has had an election for every single person, and they have either been elected or reelected. Okay. Now, you also need to know the difference between enumerated and implied powers. Enumerated, we talked about this last unit, means written down in a list, explicitly stated. And so the enumerated powers are powers that have been written down in the Constitution. Implied powers are things that are not written down, but are kind of obvious. Like, well, of course Congress is going to do that, right? So you do need to know the difference between those two things. And then some of those powers that we're going to talk about are the federal budget. You do need to know that the federal budget has to originate in the House. You need to know that, and you also need to know the phrase power of the purse. That's a very common phrase for the fact that the House has power over our federal budget. They have fiscal power. And so fiscal policy is always enacted by the House, government spending and taxation changes. Declaring war is a legislative power. A war resolution has to be passed in order to declare war, and the president cannot declare war, contrary to popular belief. A lot of people think that, but he can take diplomacy actions to kind of egg on a war, but the Congress has to be the one to declare it, which is another example of checks and balances, right? Interstate commerce is a federal power given to Congress. They can regulate a business between states, including taxation of those businesses. Immigration is a federal power given to Congress, specifically naturalization. So like becoming a citizen, that's all of those processes are regulated by Congress. And then just like legislation in general, laws, anything that needs to get passed that is necessary and proper. And so we, last unit, remember, talked about McCulloch versus Maryland, the idea that like the elastic clause exists that the Congress, can do whatever they need to do in order to do their job. And so that's kind of their last kind of catch-all job there. Okay. Next, let's talk about 2.2. 2.2 is about the structures, powers, and functions of Congress. So basically, how do they do their job? If we know that their job is to pass legislation, well, how do they do that? So let's start with how laws get passed. This is going to get a little complicated, and you don't necessarily need to memorize every step of this process, but you do need to have a general understanding of the main points in the process. Okay. So let's talk about how a bill becomes a law if it starts in the House. Now, a bill can start in the House or the Senate, which just means that a person in the House, a representative, or a senator from the Senate can write a bill, okay, with the exception of a budget bill or money, taxes, things like that. That has to start in the House. But everything else, generally speaking, can start in the House or the Senate. So let's say we're starting in the House. Let's say a congressman gets an idea for a bill. So he will get an idea for a law, write it down, and he'll write this bill. Then the bill goes to the House, and they will read it over, and the House Majority Leader usually will assign it to a House committee. Now, there are a lot of committees in the House, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, but they are groups of people who have expertise in things. So there's an education committee, a war committee, a finance committee, a rules committee, all these things. And so they'll assign the bill to a committee. The bill will go to the committee, and they will discuss it. They will usually edit it, and they will bring it to the House floor. Now, this right here is where most bills die. A bill dying means it never becomes a bill, obviously. And so a bill dying on the committee floor happens about 90% of the time. Most bills, 90% of bills, do not actually make it to the House floor. Now, let's say it does make it to the House floor. Everyone in the House will then vote on the bill. If they vote no, the bill dies on the floor, okay? Which is like, that's literally what they call it. They call it dying on the floor of Congress. Now, let's say they do pass it, and this is very, very rare and very, very difficult, and that's for a reason. It's a natural check on legislative power. It's supposed to be a complex process. You're not supposed to be able to pass a bill very easily, because then that could elevate the power of the federal government, specifically the legislature. Now, let's say they do vote on the bill, they vote yes, and then, they're good with it, right? Then it goes to the Senate, and the whole process starts over again. If you've ever watched the Schoolhouse Rock, I'm Just a Bill, this flowchart is that song. The bill is introduced in the Senate. They read it over. They assign it to a committee. The committee discusses edits and then brings it to the Senate floor. It can also die in this committee. Then, if they like it and they bring it to the Senate floor, the Senate votes on it. If they vote no, it dies on the floor. So you see there are so many off-ramps, right? There are so many ways for bills to die. It's extremely rare. Different numbers and percentages have kind of gone through, but somewhere between 1% to 2% of bills end up getting passed through these two processes, closer to that 1% number. And then there's one more step. So if it doesn't die on the floor and everyone votes yes, then it goes to the president. Now, you might know that the president can veto a bill. This is pretty rare, actually. It does not happen very often. If it has gotten to the president's desk, it is probably, in his opinion at least, a decent bill. He can sign it, and I'd say, 99% of the time, he does end up signing those bills. Or he can veto it. Vetoing does not mean rejecting it. Technically, it means sending it back to the House of Origin, which in this case would be the House of Representatives. Now, if it gets vetoed, technically it can still pass. That's because a veto requires a 2/3 vote in both houses to be overridden. This is so that if there is a split government, which means the president is one party and the Congress, House and Senate are another party, and the president does not like that the House and Senate are of the opposite party, he could, in theory, just veto all the bills because he's mad, right? And so this workaround or override is what it's called, allows for that not to be an issue. And so it just limits the power of that check from the president to the legislature, while it's still allowing him to make sure that there are not crazy laws getting passed. If it starts in the Senate, the same process happens, but just starts in the Senate, then goes to the House, and then goes to the president. So, who is in Congress? Let's talk about it. So you do need to know a lot of the names that are going to be on this slide right here. So this right here is going to be the leadership positions in Congress. You need to know like 4 big ones. Ready? Number 1, you need to know the Senate, the president of the Senate, is the vice president. So right now, that would be J.D. Vance, our vice president, and he is the president of the Senate. And remember how earlier I mentioned that sometimes this gets tricky with the fact that the Senate has 100 members, so there could be a 50-50 tie. If there is a tie in the Senate, the vice president is the tiebreaker. You need to know that. It has been on your AP exam before. The vice president is the tiebreaker in the Senate because he is the president of the Senate. You also need to know the president pro tempore, which is the senior ranking member, which means the person who has been there the longest, that has seniority, of the majority party. So right now, that would be the Republican Party as of 2026. But it does change. And so when there are changes in power structures, so if, for example, next year after midterms, the Democratic Party takes over as the majority party, meaning just that there are more Democrats than Republicans in the Senate, then the president pro tempore would change. Okay. Then you have majority and minority leaders. Majority leader just means the leader of the party that has more members. So right now that would be a Republican. They are voted on by other senators. They're chosen by the other senators. Then you need to know what a whip is. A whip, both Senate and House have whips. And what this is a position, by the way, this has been on your AP exam before as well, that the Senate whips and the House whips, what they do is whip up votes is the phrase. And what that means is they are in charge of making sure that people are voting with their party, right? And a lot of people think of this and say, oh, why would they want to do that? Why wouldn't everyone want to be just voting with their conscience, right? Why shouldn't we just vote for what's right? And that is understandable as a position To the party, though, power is in numbers. And so if they are united as a party, the whip is very powerful in that regard, in that they make sure that everyone in the party is voting together in order to make sure they are united as a united front. Because in fact, in theory, they are kind of the opposition to the other party. And so they want to make sure that they have as many people voting with them as possible. So that is the whip's job, is to kind of enact social pressure to make sure everyone's voting as one, basically. And then you also have the Speaker of the House, and you need to know the Speaker of the House is kind of like the Senate Majority Leader, except for the House. It's the House Majority Leader, so that's the Speaker of the House. And then there's also a floor leader for the House as well. So you just need to know like all the different names. I don't think anyone's necessarily going to ask you like, what's the name of the House Minority Whip? No one cares about that. But if you're asked about Congress's leadership positions, you need to be able to explain at least 3 or 4 of these positions. And I know that has been an FRQ option before, that AP exam has asked, how does Congress enact legislation using its leadership, basically? And so the answer to that would have been through House leadership, through the President pro tempore in the Senate, and then the Senate or the House Majority Leader in the House, and then the Vice President serving as the President of the Senate, and then the whips. And so you needed to be able to pull all of that out of your head to answer that question. So how does Congress function? Let's talk about it. We already said earlier we were going to talk about committees. Committees are groups of people, like I said, that have expertise in a topic area, right? So education, finance, military, veterans, things like that. The leadership of a committee is always the majority party. You need to know that. That has also been on your AP exam. So very tested topic here. You need to know that in the Education Committee in Congress, the leader of that committee is always a Republican right now, because they are the majority party of Congress. If that changes, the leader of the committees change as well. You need to know the difference between standing, special, joint, or joining. I call them joint committees. So in the old kind of papers, sometimes they call them joining committees. The AP exam usually calls them joint committees, and then conference committees. So you need to know the difference between those 4. Standing committees are committees that have been around, will stay around, they're permanent. So, and that's like the majority of the committees are standing committees. They're just like the default committees that are always going to be there. Then there are special committees, and those are going to be committees that are just there for a little bit. So they're called to issue their insight on a specific problem. So like a war that we just declared, right? Sorry, my phone's going off. Or COVID-19. COVID-19 is actually a great example where they called it for a temporary purpose. Okay. Then a joint committee is when the Senate and House get together to have a either standing or special committee, but between the 2 houses. So it could be standing or special, but a joint committee is when the House and Senate are working together on something. And then a conference committee is like a joint committee, but it's temporary. And it's really only about one bill usually. So like it's going to be like this one bill we have to get through. For example, like a budget bill, right? And we're about to have a government shutdown. We have to get this through. We have to collaborate on this, but it's really just for this one thing, and then we're going to get rid of it. Like even more temporary than a joint committee or a special committee. The other thing to know, I already mentioned this, is that the House of Representatives has power of the purse. I'm mentioning it twice because it is important and it is almost always on your AP exam. You need to know that. You also need to know the difference in mandatory versus discretionary spending. We mentioned this in AP Macro, but mandatory spending is spending that is mandatory, obviously. But what I mean by that is it is spending that has to happen based on the law. For example, Social Security. It is a law that people who receive Social Security checks as part of their retirement get that money. If we were not to spend that money, we would be in violation of the law. We legally have to give those people their money. Whereas discretionary spending, for example, most military spending is discretionary. Now, we don't mean optional. We kind of have to have a military, according to most people. But discretionary spending is basically, it's kind of up to the government on how much we spend. There's not a law that says we have to spend XYZ amount of dollars. You also need to know that the Senate has a procedure called a filibuster. A filibuster is when the Senate, a specific senator, can effectively stall a vote on a law. For example, several senators have done this in order to prevent anti-abortion legislation from going through, or anti-healthcare legislation. There have been bills where a senator has proposed to cut an essential program, and so another senator will filibuster, which just means they talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. I've always said that I would be very good at filibustering. And effectively what you're doing is stalling to prevent a vote until the session ends. And there are a lot of rules on that, and we'll talk more about that in class. You also need to know that cloture is a way to end a filibuster. So if 60 out of 100 senators vote to end the filibuster, that is called a cloture. You need to know that term. For some reason, College Board really likes putting cloture on the AP exam. It's also a really good thing to pull out of your hat for an FRQ if they ask you about the functions of Congress. And then you also need to know the ideas of pork barrel legislation / earmarks. They're very related terms. Basically, these two things refer to the fact that Congress can pass laws with like add-ons to them. And a pork barrel is the idea that pigs will eat anything, right? So if a pork barrel is just you throw in all the things you don't want. And so like a bunch of random stuff goes into the pork barrel. And so pork barrel legislation is this bill full of a bunch of random small things that all get passed together in the same way that a bunch of slop might get put into a pork barrel and then fed to the pigs all at once. And so a lot of times that will happen when a congressperson might want to get reelected. And so they might try to put a little bit of legislation in a bigger bill that says, oh, by the way, Belton, Texas gets some funding for their new road or something, right? It's a way to kind of put money aside for your district or maybe do a favor for someone in your district in order to get reelected. And it happens on both sides of the aisle. It's very common. And then log rolling is the last thing. Log rolling is going to be a practice where it's kind of based on the phrase like you scratch your back, my back, I'll scratch yours, right? And so it's the idea that Congresspeople will trade favors a lot. They'll say, well, I'll vote yes on your bill if you vote yes on my bill. And it seems like a shady kind of practice, and it can be for sure, but it's also something that prevents gridlock. And so that brings us to 2.3. 2.3 is the idea of like how Congress behaves, right? What do they do? How do they do things? And so partisan voting and polarization, which basically just means that what we were talking about with the whips, right? That people vote with their party. And when sometimes that makes sense, but sometimes that can lead to what we call gridlock. Gridlock is the idea that we are stuck in legislative traffic and no one wants to move. And so we're all just sitting and honking at each other, basically. And so in practice, that means that everyone wants their vote and they're voting the same way every time and they're not compromising. And so nothing gets accomplished. And so log rolling can kind of help grease the wheels, so to speak, to kind of get rid of that traffic and help people get things done. Another thing to know about, this is not in relation to gridlock, another different note of congressional behavior is gerrymandering and redistricting. You probably already learned about this in a previous class, and we're going to be talking about Baker v. Carr and Shaw v. Reno later on in the unit. Baker v. Carr and Shaw v. Reno are both gerrymandering cases that the Supreme Court has ruled on. Excuse me. Baker v. Carr effectively ruled that the Supreme Court can, in fact, rule on gerrymandering cases in some cases. So they have the power to talk and rule on gerrymandering, which is not something that the Constitution might imply because elections are supposed to be a state power. So to kind of clarify, gerrymandering is the idea that we can redraw districts in order to manipulate elections. And it happens on both sides of the aisle. Both parties do it. But they are redistricting and redrawing election maps in order to strategically advantage one party or the other or one group. Baker v. Carr ruled that the federal government can rule on cases related to gerrymandering. And then Shaw v. Reno ruled that racial gerrymandering, which is gerrymandering that is supposed to favor one racial group or another, is unconstitutional and a violation of a lot of different clauses in the Constitution, mostly due process and equal protection. But we will talk more about those in class. Those are the two main things you need to know about those cases, though, is Baker v. Carr ruled we can rule on them at a federal level, even though elections are a state power. And then Shaw v. Reno says no racial gerrymandering. Excuse me. And then next one is going to be the idea of partisanship. So you need to know the term partisanship. This is the idea of being very loyal to your party and not willing to see the other party's side, which I'm sure you know is very, very common, very, very typical in Congress. And so this can lead to some issues, specifically in a divided government. A divided government is, or like I said earlier, when the House and Senate are one party and the president is another party. Now, as of 2026, both of those groups, both of those branches are Republican, which has led to, actually a lot of legislation getting passed because the Republican House and Senate find it very easy for the Republican president to sign off on their bills, which makes sense. They're both the same party. If it's a divided government, unfortunately, this can lead to issues of gridlock because the president and the House and Senate can't agree on anything. So that he won't sign their legislation, and then they won't fund his programs, and it's just a whole thing. And so this can lead to what we call a lame duck presidency. We will talk more about this later on in a later topic, but basically that means the president can't get anything done. He's just kind of sitting there like a lame duck. The other last thing you need to know in this unit, video's almost over, is the 3 models of constituent accountability. What this means is that Congress people have what's called constituents, which are people they represent. And they are accountable to those constituents, which means it's their job to represent those constituents through republicanism. There are 3 ways to think about this. The trustee model, the delegate model, and the political model. Okay? And so the thing to remember here is that, number one, this is going to be very helpful when it comes to like an FRQ if you are talking about Congress and you are thinking about the ways that Congress behaves, okay? And so the trustee model is when a congressperson uses kind of their own judgment and does kind of what they want when it comes to passing legislation. It kind of sounds like a bad thing the way I put it, but it's not inherently bad. It just means that they're using their own moral compass to pass legislation rather than listening to their constituents, which can be good or bad, right? It kind of goes against the idea of republicanism, but it also is kind of pro-Federalist 10, right? Going against the idea of the majority winning all the time, right? So it's kind of a way to protect the minority rights. The delegate model sees themselves as a delegate or like an extension of their constituents. And so effectively what they do is they listen to what their constituents want and they do whatever they want, even if they think it's wrong, right? So it's kind of, there's not really a good or bad there. It's just kind of different ways to look at being a congressperson. And then a political model is the combination of those two. It's kind of based on what they think is right in the moment. If they see intense support for a bill, even though they're not really sure about it, they might vote yes on that bill. But on the other hand, in another bill, if most of their constituents are pro whatever law getting passed, but they know in their heart of hearts that this is wrong based on their expertise, they might not pass that bill. Just a kind of blended way of looking at it. All right, that is 2.3. Next time we will look at the executive branch. Bye, guys.